Mr. Joe Weinberg. If you don't mind, I'm going to get comfortable. That doesn't mean I'm going to sit here a long time. Comfortable. I'll tell you the truth, I was surprised to get the call from Billy. I don't feel I'm important, and I didn't think I was important enough to be invited, to be very honest with you. The only thing I can tell you right off the bat, I was born in Farmville. This is mine. I was born, and I was going to tell you this a little later, but I'll tell you this now. I was born in Dr. Thomas Hardy's home, in the basement. That was the hospital back when I was born. He had a room. And at that time, my mother, God rest her soul, was having a terrible time with delivery. And I later found out that he came out and told my father, didn't tell him, he asked him, he said, I'm having a hard time, and I may be able to stay one, losing one. My father picked, naturally, his wife. But we were lucky to both survive. But I think you can understand that I know a little bit about the area. I'm not talking as a stranger. Now, I think it's only fair that I spend my time giving you my family's history in farm. I think that's the part that you're interested in. And most of it will be telling you about my father. Those of you who knew him will, in honesty, probably say he was a great businessman. He had many people who loved him, and I didn't know how many until he died. And I have a box of letters, people telling me how good he was.
Speak up a little louder.
Yes, and I do have a good voice, but I don't like to shout because I think then people think I can't hear. But I said I'm going to spend most of my time, I think, talking about my father. I will give you some background, others in the family. But he really was a patriarch in this area in Farmville. They came, when I say they, and I'll explain later why the people that came to Farmville. They came in about 1970. Nobody seems to know, even my dad didn't know the exact year. But it was around 1917 when they came to Farmville. Farmville, if you've seen any pictures in the Herald, Farmville back around the 20s. This was even before then. So you saw horse and buggies and wagons and so forth.
Louder, Joe, please.
Okay. I said that when my family came to Farmville, the family you know, it was around 1970. They moved here from Baltimore. And the reason they moved here was my grandfather, my dad's father, was an excellent businessman himself. He had one bad habit. He liked to gamble. And he would make it and lose it as fast as he made it. And he would move around the country, really. And he happened to come to Farmville one day, and it stuck in his mind as being a place that he thought would be a good place to open business. He didn't do it, but that was something that eventually brought the family to farm. My grandmother, my father's mother, and my father and his two brothers, Philip and David, came to Farmville at that time. I don't know how many of you remember any of those people. Any of you remember David? Okay. I don't know whether you remember Philip or not, but he had a business in Farmville. My dad set everybody up in business. As they became old enough, he would finance them to get them started in business. Philip had a store, a little shoe store down here for about 5 years. And then he moved to Blackstone and opened a department store in Blackstone, also called the Hub. Now, in 1921, my dad married my mother, who was in Tar Heel. She's from a very small town in North Carolina, about the size of Rice. My grandfather had a little country store and was a potato farmer. He had, I don't know how many acres, but there were a large number of acres in potatoes. And I don't have to tell you that he rose and tide like he rose and fell like the tide. When there wasn't enough water, I mean, that was it. And he never made a lot of money because whatever he made paid off the debts when he wasn't doing so well. I think many farmers in here probably know what that's like. So my mother came to Farmville, and to her, this was a metropolis, because she had left absolutely nothing there. I mean, it was just, I think there were probably 300 people, 300, 400 people. In fact, they had a county school, and they didn't have any transportation, and she used to walk 2.5 miles to school and 2.5 back every day. I'm going to try to cut this down some. Now my dad and his father were very close. He absolutely adored his father. And yet, when my dad was 13 years old, his father died at the age of 33. And he was brokenhearted, absolutely devastated. From what I've heard, it took him about 2 to 3 years to even think about his father without crying. And at that time, he had to go to work. He actually went to the 5th grade. I don't think many of you would have realized how little education he had by talking to him, because he was very self-conscious of the fact that he lacked an education. And he did everything he could on his own to remedy that fact. He read widely. He also, in later days, I don't know how many of you get the Reader's Digest, but I don't know whether it's still in there because I don't get it, but there used to be a section where you could improve your vocabulary. There was a page, and he would memorize that thing every time it came out, and then ask my mother to give him the word and let him tell him the meaning of it, and then vice versa, she would switch it around. So he did a pretty good job. Very few people would ever have known that he only went to the 5th grade. He did the same thing with math. He was able to do good basic math, bookkeeping, things like that. Now, David was the luckiest of the 3 boys. He was able to go to the 11th grade in Farmville High School. same building that you and I went to. And he played on the first team of the football team. He was very proud of that. They had, I understand, a fairly good team. Philip, we don't know too much about him, but we think he went to about the 8th grade. And he was the last one. He died in '92, and he died this past year. So he's the last of that branch of the family. We have a very small family. I think we have relatives somewhere. Where they are, your guess is as good as mine. I know of about 4 different families of cousins that I know. And most of them live in Baltimore. Now, Dad, when he had to go out and earn money, he was too young to, even in those days when they hired young people, he was still too young to get a job. So he was in Baltimore, and he sold newspapers on the corner. He did that for 2 years, rain, snow, shine, didn't make any difference, invoice money, pennies and nickels to his mother. They helped support the family. After he got about, we estimate, around 15 years old, he was full grown, appearance-wise. He decided that he was old enough to do stuff beside newspapers, and he went to West Virginia. He heard they were looking for miners. And he'd never done anything type of work in his life. But he went out there, got a job, and he told me he was 17. And the foreman hired him. He went down in the mine, and the only thing I ever got out of him was this. He said, I felt like I was in a tomb. He said, I stayed down there 3 days, and I could not stay on the ground. It was just awful. So he came out and he found a job in the same town with a man who had a men's haberdashery, men's store. And he worked for him for about a year and a half and found he liked doing that kind of thing. He went back to Baltimore to his mother and went to work in a department store. It was, then we figured somewhere around 17 or so. And he worked there for about a year, and he couldn't get a job. It was a recession like. And when he went to them, every place he went turned him down. And he went to this one store, which would be the equivalent today of the old Miller Roads. And he went to them, and they turned him down. And he said, I'll make you a proposition. I'll work for nothing. Don't pay me anything. Just give me 10% of whatever I sell. If I don't sell anything, it doesn't cost you anything. If I sell a very little bit, it's still not going to hurt you. And they put him in, he always told me this, he put him in the shade department, which wasn't a very good department. I don't guess it ever is in any department. But he, at the end of the time he left, he was #1 in sales. He was making big money. 10%, I think he said he took home going to be $10. And that was big money. So he got his education that way, as far as business goes. Now, when they moved here, the store that they opened, my father and his mother opened this small general store almost on Main Street. I mean, they just had what the farm people, clothes they need, overalls, things like that. And they lived upstairs. And if none of you have ever lived in downtown Farmville, in the middle of the summertime, when there was no air conditioning, no electric fans, and a hot, flat roof right behind the back window, you don't know what fun is. Now, I tell you, that bedroom, I had no idea what the temperature was, but I know I used to strip down to my shorts. And I'd wake up in the morning cool. I mean, the whole bed was soaking wet. It was, people, they don't know what that's like. But believe me, it's not very comfortable. Now, he lived over top of his store, not in those conditions, of course, because as things came along to improve those conditions, we improved our living conditions. Until 1950. Now, in between that, a lot of things had happened. David had worked in the store. That was one thing we don't have today. I didn't have it in my family. I don't see it in many families around where the family stays together and works together. Used to be on the farms that do that, but even today, young men don't want to stay on the farm. They want to go do something else. But in those days, the family, we all worked in the store. My mother, my father, his two brothers, his mother, and one time they had one employee other than themselves. And that was a young lady from up at Prospect. I think Robert used to live somewhere around there. He's familiar with that family, the Glenn family. And Margaret Glenn used to work in our store, one of our first employees. And Dave became infatuated with her, and they got married. Now, we'll finish up with Dave real quick. After he stayed there with Marguerite and continued to work for my father for a number of years. Dad and he, I guess, probably him, came to Dad and said, I want to do something else, but I work for you the rest of my life. And Dad said, fine, what are you going to do? Well, I'll find something. And anyway, they got together. My dad financed him and bought him the property down on the lower end of Main Street. The corner there where the Land Sharks building is now, and the little diner, all that was old buildings there. And at one time there was a freight station right down on the end next to the railroad track. But he bought a couple of those buildings. They went into business with a company that I think all of you will remember the name of them, most of them, Farmer Supply. And he bought, as he got along, he bought more and more buildings. So that he had all of that block down there for the Farmer Supply, except for the freight station at the end. And he lived there, lived in Farmville all his life, died here, and I think was a real asset as a gentleman to the town. Everybody loved him, and by the time he was about 50 years old, until he died, he was known as Uncle Dave. Everybody knew Uncle Dave, and the reason for it was that he was so patient, so kind. People would come in, they'd buy a fishing reel from him one summer. Next summer it was all jammed up. And he'd be waiting on the customer, and they'd come up to him and say, I've got to get out, my wife's waiting, can you do something for me? He'd stop waiting on his customer and go over there and fiddle with that reel for a half hour to get it to work so the man could take it out and go fishing. Well, that's the kind of man he was. He loved children. All the kids in the neighborhood on First Avenue, when they were growing up, would come over to him. He'd play with them, play games with them, play ball with them, anything, keep them occupied. Now, we go to my recollections of Tom. The earliest thing that I can remember was the fire of 1926. That's when a large portion of the main part of downtown was destroyed. Now, people who know about it, excuse me, Ryan Malsky was out and talking. Anybody here know anything about that fire? Or about where it was? Well, I'm going to tell you what I can find out about it, but not from reading, just from listening. And if I'm wrong, you all tell me. I understand it started somewhere down around what used to be called Davidson's Alley, right next door to the old Davidson's department store. Not in that building, but further up towards where the hub was, somewhere down in that lower end there, about where the Southern Hardware used to be. And it rapidly progressed going up the street towards the hub. It was in the evening, and my first recollection in my life, if I go back and try to think how far back I can go, was my mother grabbing me. I was 3 years old, grabbing me and throwing a blanket over me. But I remember the blanket, so I figured it must have been in the fall year. I don't know when, what time of the year it was. But anyway, she threw a blanket over me and took me across the street to Chapels. That was an institution. How many people remember Chapels? Okay. But you know what that was. That was a meeting place for most of the doctors and the business people and the kids and everybody. It was a sandwich and ice cream shop and a get-together place. And they stayed open every night until in the evening sometime, I think around 9 o'clock. Anyway, I can remember having a blanket thrown over me and my mother crying and rushing me across the street. I can remember her handing me to somebody. I said, take care of him. I guess that's what she said. But I can remember being passed on to somebody. And the next thing I remember was sitting in somebody's lap, and they had a pot-bellied stove back towards the middle of the stove. And somebody was holding me, and I was sitting there beside that stove, and I was looking out the front of the stove, and then I can remember seeing a huge fire. I never saw anything like that 3 years old in my life. So that's what I remember. I don't remember anything else. The rest of it is what I was told. My mother went back out, and the whole family pitched in and tried to save as much of the merchandise as they had. They didn't have a whole lot of insurance. Most of the insurance he had was on the building, not on the contents. And they brought the stuff out and put it on the sidewalk over in front of the chapel store. Stacked it all up down there. From there, of course, they were out of business, but he collected some insurance and he borrowed money and he rebuilt the building and went back into business. Now, during that fire, David, who had joined the Farmville Volunteer Fire Department, as soon as he finished helping his brother get much stuff out of the store they could before the fire got to the building, as soon as he had finished his job there, he went back to the fire department. And his job was to get on top of the roof with a hose and try to keep the tops of the building wet. And the fire was coming and he was moving. And he would jump from one building to the other. And he made one jump that he didn't land right, and he did tremendous damage to his ankle. He got over that, but he always had trouble with it in his later life. It was very, very painful. He really suffered with that ankle. Now, when my dad rebuilt, he didn't have peanuts. what he's borrowed. And he worked, people, I guess on farms, probably know what I'm talking about because they worked that hard and that long. In those days, I don't know what they do today. But he would open his store at 8 o'clock and he was in there until 10, 11 o'clock at night, 6 days a week. You figure that up, it's around 75 hours a week. Now, he wasn't all selling customers. He did everything. He taught himself how to paint signs, and he was a good sign painter. He taught himself how to make banners for windows. He taught himself, he'd go to Richmond, and he'd look in the store windows and see how they dressed their windows, and he'd come back, and he was painstaking about it. He'd spend hours in the windows in the summertime, hot, sweating. He'd do it at night after people were left, and he'd go back down, he'd supper and go back down there and stay in that hot window until he got a window that suited him. From then on, it's a story of hardship, because then he ran into depression. And he had some investments, and he, like most everybody else, lost it all. And he was right back down at the bottom again. In fact, things got so bad that his creditors were shoving him. And one particular company in New York got a warrant out. And I don't know what they do now. Thank God I've never had that problem. But then they could padlock your door. The sheriff would come, padlock your door, close you up. And any of you remember Taylor Thompson, Sr.? All right, you know the story of him, I won't go into this. But I'll tell you this, he was a lifesaver to my father. My father never forgot it. Never. When other people weren't speaking so well about it, he would take up for it. He saved my father, me, and he came down and saw Dad, and this is what Dad has told me, of course, I didn't hear this. But he said, "Man, don't you worry." He said, "They'll never close you up. You're a Southern boy, and we're not going to let those Northerners come down here and close the Southern boy up." So that actually, he prevented it from happening. Dad was able to come out and things. And then it was just a matter of working hard and saving all over again. And as other people in the Depression began to fold up, couldn't make it, the money that he saved by working hard and being very frugal, he wasn't tight. Nobody will ever say my dad was tight. But he didn't waste money. He wouldn't just splurge. He saved it. And when these other businesses were getting ready to close up or had to close, he'd go to them and buy it out. Buy their stock, buy their business. And in some cases, he would run the store under the old name. He'd keep maybe the manager of the store, one of the workers of the store, and promote him to manager and keep the store going. Now, at one time, he, to me, did a remarkable thing. You know, many people are good at certain things. Doctors are good at being doctoring. Farmers may be good at tobacco. But my father had his fingers into everything and did well at it. Now that's unusual. But one time he had 7 stores going, all of them different. I mean, it wouldn't be so bad if he had 7 stores and they're all doing the same thing and you could go buy for 7 stores. But he had to go out and buy for 7 different stores, 7 different kinds of people. And nobody to do it but him. And nobody but him to do the financing. Nobody but him to run the business. Nobody but him to sell. He was the star salesman, the star financier, you name it, he was the whole works. At one time he had the home furniture. How many of you remember that? Okay. Then he had the Dorothy May. Now, you know what store I'm talking about? What store is it now? Right, he renamed it when my mother died, to her name. It was originally a combination of her name and the wife of his brother. Her name was, her middle name was May, so they picked it up and made it Dorothy May. Not Marguerite, the other brother. And when she died, he renamed it the Esther May. He had the Hub department store, which in his day was a big store for a small town. Then he had the bootery. Then he had the 3L shop. Anybody know what 3L stood for? It was a large person store, and it stood for lovely large ladies. Then he had the Squire shop. And then he had the Southern Hardware. And you can see that mixes about like tobacco and oranges. I mean, there's nothing in common. They're all different. He, I think he was successful because of what he tried to instill in me. You can be a good businessman, you can be a hard businessman, but be fair. Do not take advantage of somebody who can't afford to be taken advantage of. When you mark merchandise, mark it at a fair price that's fair to you and fair to your buyer. When you give your word, live up to it, no matter how bad it may hurt. Do not hold back on pay of your employees. In most cases, they need it more than you do. Pay them when they're due to be paid. I found that, you may have learned that from Mason. I don't know, he was a 32nd degree Shriner. And when I went to the Masonic Lodge, that's one of the tenants there also. Now, as far as him as an individual, what did he do? Most people say he was a good businessman, a hard businessman. Some people say he was hard to get along with. He wasn't hard to get along with unless you tried to outdo him. If you thought you could outsmart him, you have another thought about it. And a lot of people got angry when that didn't take place. But as I said, he was good. His heart was bigger than his body ever was. Now, he did many, many, many charitable things, not for groups, for individuals. I can remember from the time I first started working in the store when I was about 13. People, Red Cross in that time, and I don't remember what they called it, welfare thing, but they had something here. Do anybody know what they called it? You could look to do something for the real poor and destitute. There was some organization here, and I can't remember. But the Red Cross and that group used to come to him and say, such and such family burn out. They don't have anything. What can you do for them? He said, bring them in. Bring them all in, he outfit them top to bottom. Blankets, and we carried it in the department store. We had everything, sheets, towels, everything. He outfitted them top to bottom, and the only thing he asked was, don't tell him. He didn't want Red Cross to say anything about it. He didn't want anybody to know about it. I didn't know many of the things that he did until after he died, when I got letters telling me what he had done for them. But that went on for years. anytime, Christmas time, families that didn't have anything to give their children, any clothes, anything, they bring them in, eat it out, fill them, and he would tell them, he wouldn't give them the poster. He would outfit them and say, well, maybe Santa Claus might bring them to you. And then they take the children out and he'd give all the clothes to the parents to give for Christmas. And I guess one of the biggest charities that nobody ever realized unless they have been in that business is credit business. Farmville was a farm town. Tobacco was its product. And people didn't always have money, as any farmer can tell you. But they'd come to him and they'd say, "Daniel, I don't have any money, but if I have a crop next year, I'll pay you." He'd put them on the books, give everything they wanted. And he had people on the books 6, 7, 8 years. Sometimes they died. I mean, they just wash it out, go on. But I can tell you this, because he was good to them, they did the best they could to pay him back. They didn't charge him a cent of interest. Nothing ever added to it other than the price that they paid for it when they bought it. And there's thousands of dollars were charged off the books and never were paid. So, in his own way, he did his good deeds. Nobody ever knew about it. Now, he traveled. When did Rice and Burkeville first get electric current? Anybody know in the back country, back routes? Ralph Burkeville, I'd say, in that area.
1924 to 26.
All right. Well, now some of those back routes, I mean, when I say back, I mean 10 miles back in the country, little road. Some of, you're right, that's the first one. But then after World War II, they began to try to get those people some current. And they started spreading out, what's that outfit down there?
So sad.
Southside
Electric.
They started trying to get further back in the countryside. And Dad, being a good businessman, he said, well, if they're going to get current, they're going to want a refrigerator. So he never handled a refrigerator. He stuck them in the store, right in the department store. He put some refrigerators in the store and then he wasn't selling any. So he took one of the pickup trucks and he put it, tied a refrigerator on the back, and he went throughout the counties, the 5 surrounding counties. I don't think he missed a road that had a power line going down. Anything he saw with a wire going down, he went down the road. And he stopped at every house. He didn't miss a home. And he really sold a pile of refrigerators. Where nobody else was doing anything like that. He bring it right to their home. And of course, he got to know the people. He would talk to them. He was very friendly. He remembered faces and he remembered names pretty good too. And he loved people. He loved to talk to them. So he'd sit down and he'd have lunch with them. They'd invite him in. He'd have lunch or he'd have dinner or whatever time of day it was. And then he'd get up and come on back home. Well, those people never forgot it. He'd go in anywhere. He'd drive down 360, he'd drive down 60, drive down 15, 45. Any of the back roads off that, if he stopped to get up, he'd get sleepy when he was driving. And he found he had to either eat or drink or he'd fall asleep. So he would stop in little stores and he'd buy some bologna and some bread or soft drink or something else. And he'd walk in the store. He couldn't walk in a store where they didn't know. Mr. Weinberg, what you doing down here? I mean, everywhere. It was remarkable. He also, if any of y'all, and I think some of the older ones remember, you know, during hard times, the churches always tried to raise money. The women would cook, and they'd have church dinners and charge to feed it over to the public, bring, come to the dinner to raise money. And whenever he heard about it, whenever they come to him and say, we're having one, Mr. Weinberg, why don't you come eat, bring all of his employees. He'd go down and pay for all the employees. They were, I mean, sometimes it was 25, 30 of them at a time. But he didn't do that for business. He did that because he liked people. He loved talking to the people in the country. He'd go there and sit down and reminisce with them and just chat. Now, why was he successful? Good businessman, energetic, not lazy, smart, intelligent, and caring for people. You put it all together, it sort of comes out on the good side. And in addition to that, he was right. He said, if you're in business, you've got to stay up with the times, or you will fall by the wayside. So he made it a point to try to set aside enough money that every 10 to 12 years he could remodel either the outside or the inside. New fixtures, new something, everything had to be done over. And because of that, his competition either had to do that or fall by the wayside. So everybody would follow a manual. The manual was started, and then bing, 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 and they'd start remodeling too. And Barry Wald, any of y'all remember him? J. Barry Wald? He told me he was one of the many that have told me in various ways this. They said, Joe, you ought to be proud of your father. He is probably the driving force that has made Farmville move away from a sleepy little town to the center for 5 counties. Because they had to follow him. They had to do something to stay up with him in business. I'm not saying that that's what's been told to me. Now, he died in 1982, just 3 months short of his 81st birthday. But up until 3 months, and he died of cancer. And he fought it. But of course, everybody, I guess, has to die sometime. That was the way he died. But he worked in his store up until 3 months before he died. He just couldn't drag anymore. He would rather, I guess if he had his way, he'd like to have been sitting in the store when he passed away, because that was very dear to him. Now, I'm through with that part of it, and I'll tell you a little bit about me. I think most of you know me, probably know more about me than I know about myself, or want to know about myself. I graduated from Farmville High School in 1940. Robert, I guess you were ahead of me by how much?
37.
3 years ahead of me. I entered the University of Virginia at the age of 16. Not because I was so smart, but Farmville only had 11 grades at that time. So I was 16 years old when I went to Virginia. The war broke, I went there in 1940. The war broke out in 41. I can remember, it's like, I guess they say when you get old, you remember things from the past than you do the current. But to me, this is like living that day. I had gone to movie Sunday in Charlottesville, Sunday afternoon. I came back, I lived in a boarding house because I had a problem. This may shock you. today, it's like having our black gas with us tonight. I mean, that didn't used to be. When I went to the University of Virginia, I didn't decide to go until just before school started. And I couldn't get a room at the university. They were filled. But there were boarding houses all around, mostly widows, single people, women, ran for the students. And we went to look for a boarding house. We started out at 10 o'clock in the morning and with rent, for rent signs up on the houses. And at 3 o'clock that afternoon, my dad still didn't have a room for me. Why? Because we were Jewish. Awful thing to say. It doesn't happen that often today. Some of the questions right away, are you Jewish? I guess we look Jewish. But whatever it was, yes, we are. Sorry, we haven't. We finally hit a house, and God must have placed her there. There was a Jewish woman that ran the house. So when we got there, she didn't ask any questions. She had a sign up for rent. All she wanted to know was, do you like the room? And of course, I think we would have taken anything at that time. Dad had to be back to work the next day. He couldn't take any more time off. So that's how I got to be in this house. Now, when I came back that Sunday of December the 7th, in 1941, Pearl Harbor Day, I had just come back from the movie in the afternoon and gone back to the boarding house. And I had intended to ask some of the boys if they wanted to play some bridge before supper. And I got to the house, and they were all crowded around the radio. I said, what's going on? So we don't know. Something awful. Something about war or something like this. And we sat there until 2 o'clock in the morning, I guess, late, listening, trying to pick up scraps and bits. Well, I stayed in school until the following December, 1942. And I couldn't stand it. And like most young people, I was ready to go. And I didn't want to be drafted because I didn't want to be in the infantry. I'll be very honest with you. I couldn't see the fun in being in the mud with my nose shoved down in it. So I figured a good place to be would be in the air. So I volunteered for the Army Air Corps, which is now, of course, U.S. Air Force. I was called up after I volunteered in, I think it was March of 43. And I reported to my first base. The basic training was in Miami, Florida. How would you like that for? I mean, the government had taken over all the hotels on the beach, except I think there were 3 left for civilian use. And you know, what's Hubbard's name? Not Hubbard.
Curtis?
No. Mighty.
Henry.
He went in the Air Force too.
And Henry.
No.
Lewis?
No, he's not here. He's not around here now. He's left when he went to Circle Down and everything. Buddy. Anybody remember Buddy Hubbard?
There were 2 of them.
Yeah.
Which Buddy Hubbard are you talking about?
Well, all I know, he was the football star.
That's what they did.
Okay, he was the star of the team. Everybody was Buddy. All right, but he went in with me. And we went down to Miami Beach. And we put up in a hotel, 4-door room, 2 double bunks. And I got my basic training there. And I went from there to Texas. And in Texas, I got all the rest of my flight training and ended up being trained for B-17 bombers. I shipped out and went to Italy. I went overseas by boat, not in a convoy, all by ourselves. And I'm telling you, talking about a nervous bunch of people on the ship. Here we were out in the middle of the Atlantic with nothing to help us. I mean, if anything hit us, we were gone. And nothing around us. And they said, didn't have anything to worry about because our ship was fast. It was doing 21 knots. So, and of course, it zigzagged all the way over there. We got there safe, of course. And I came back home in January of 1946. I was discharged in March of 46, which was like 4 years of service. I stayed in the reserve. I'm now retired Air Force Major. And I loved every minute of it, except the bad parts. But you don't think about the bad parts, you think about the good. I came back March. I married my wife in July of that same year. Sounds quick, doesn't it? And I didn't really know her. I had only dated her 2 times before. Once when she was 13 and they peddled her off on me at 16. I was 17 and in my second year at the University of Virginia, and they told me she was 16. But she was full grown in every respect and I didn't know the difference. So I took her word for it that she was 16. And then I had one more thing, brother. No, I take that back. My mother came me over when I was home, and they recommended she go to Johns Hopkins for her operation. So while she was up there, I went to Baldwin, and I got lonesome. I was up there like 2 weeks ago. And I called her. I didn't know anybody. So I called her, and we went out every night for the time I was there. We didn't miss a night. I went home, and I told my dad, took mother home. I said, well, I think I found my wife. He said, how could you find your wife? You hadn't been out with one girl. I said, well, that's her. And, of course, everything went fine. We got married. It's now 52 years later, and we still there. And I hope we can get a lot more. But I want my wife to tell you one instance that I think you'll all enjoy and get a little chuckle out of. When I was at the University of Virginia, it was for men only. The only women that were allowed to go to the University of Virginia were certain city students, people who lived in the city of Charlottesville.
They were wives of the service.
And wives of servicemen, that's right. And I took one course. To me, it was huge because I think my graduating class, if I'm not mistaken, was like 26 people in 1940. 26 or 29, I forgot which. This class had 200 students. It was an auditorium, and we sat in an auditorium, in regular auditorium seats, and took class. And my wife decided she wanted to take that class too. Not because maybe it was something she wanted to take. So I'm going to let her take over now and tell you the incident that happened.
It was a commercial law course, and it was taught by Dr. Hyde, who was about 5 foot tall and weighed about 200 pounds. But he was dark, just confusing me. And one day he said to me, Mrs. Weinberg, he said, after class, would you be so kind as to